We're joined now by our friend of the program, nutrition researcher Tucker Goodrich. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, David. How are you?
Doing great, too. I saw this tweet before the show, Dr. Benjamin Braddock, who's on Twitter, he said, I still can't get over the fact that creatine, yes, the workout supplement, outperforms SSRIs in the treatment of major depression. And thought about that. And there's so many things like that are popping up, like a cornucopia of people kind of going off the big pharma controlled reservation of what's allowed to be thought about as the solution for a lot of different issues, including things like depression.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a low bar because somebody also just came out with a systematic review that said there's no evidence that SSRIs are effective at all in depression, despite them being the primary treatment option pharmacologically for that condition.
Well, how have people been able to make so much money off of them, telling us that's the standard of care for these types of conditions?
Well, that gets us into the whole department of how poor most medical research is. There's a lot of statistical flimflammery that goes on. The whole idea of the p-value is kind of absurd. It guarantees that you're going to get a certain number of results, even though nothing's actually happening. I mean, one of the most famous examples of that was homeopathy, which is literally water, will occasionally show a positive result just by dumb luck, right? You've got two groups of people, things are going to change even if you don't do anything, right? You are literally giving two groups of people two placebos, water on one side, water on the other, except you're calling it a homeopathic cure. And just by random chance, sometimes you're going to get what they call a statistically significant difference between the two groups. That doesn't mean that one cup of water is better than the other cup of water. It just means that that's dumb luck.
Right. Yeah, there's so many things. There's a book I read called How Healing Works by Dr. Wayne Jonas, but there's all this idea that so much of the things that they approve as safe and effective for mitigating or treating certain diseases, they really don't perform at all in significance beyond the placebo, do they?
Well, yeah, that's basically true. And there's, then we can get into things where they, eliminate people who may have a problem with the treatment. They anticipate that. I mean, I saw that in, my research into rimonabant, the obesity treatment drug. They kind of suspected that it might be a problem with people who had depression. So they didn't let people who had depression be in the study. And that enabled them to give a false illusion of safety. And then when the drug was actually released, people started committing suicide.
Wow. That's insane. So I want to ask you also, what have you been researching? Typically, you get into vegetable oils and seed oils. What have you been looking at over the last week or so? Well,
the latest thing that's come up, which is, I think, something we've talked about a little in the past, is I spoke with a gentleman at the Dell School of Medicine at UT Austin, University of Texas, Austin, and he pointed out a study to me where they were looking at the effect of a low linoleic acid diet in mice. And one of the things that they discovered is that when you put mice on a low linoleic acid diet, our favorite omega-6 fat, the fat that's predominant in seed oils, they have much better fertility. And it significantly delays onset of what this researcher jokingly called mousopause, right? When the mice get menopause. And then diving down that rabbit hole, as I often do, I have found out that there are all sorts of other negative things that seem to happen when you feed mice in fertility, or mice, in pregnancy in this case, high omega-6 diets. They are more likely to get breast cancer. They are more likely to have overly aggressive offspring, which is a very, very interesting result, because there's a famous paper that was done by the NIH years ago where they found that there was a huge correlation between homicide rates in different countries and their consumption of seed oils. That was actually the first thing that I ever tried fixing in my diet, was taking more fish oil, because they'd done some studies on prisoners who are obviously a population prone to aggression, and they discovered that when they increased their fish oil intake, which is protective against high seed oil intake in some respects, a lot of these prisoners became significantly less aggressive. And that was done in the United Kingdom. That was done in Australia. Now, it seems that reducing seed oil intake is a much more effective way to do the same thing, because, if omega-6 fats are causing the increase in aggression, then reducing them will not only reduce aggression, but it'll also increase the omega-3 status in the body. So, that's when you start looking around how crazy America has been, there's a fair argument to be made that a large part of it is because we are consuming a pro-aggression, negative neurodevelopment diet, right?
So is that something that I've heard also, just by the way, that Ray Peat and his acolytes have said that eating a lot of omega-3s, though, can be overrated and problematic as well, though. I mean, how would that fit in with what you're saying here? That too much omega-3 can definitely be a problem. But if you look at the populations that have really high omega-3 intake, like, for instance, the Japanese or the Eskimos, they don't have the degree of problems. They didn't have the degree of problems prior to the introduction of omega-6 fats that they got afterward. So while there are definitely negatives to it, for instance, if you consume too much omega-3 and then you get an overdose of Tylenol, by the way, everybody, is the most dangerous drug sold in the United States in terms of overdoses. Your susceptibility to the toxicity of that drug is dependent on how much PUFA you consume. And in that case, omega-3 is actually worse than omega-6. It makes you more susceptible to an overdose, to the toxicity. So, yeah, there's definitely some cases where you can find negative. Also, when it comes to consuming too much alcohol, if you're consuming too much alcohol on a high fish diet, that seems to be a lot worse than, a high omega-6 diet is really bad in that context, but a high fish oil diet is even worse, it seems. And a lot of the omega-3 products are oxidized and rancid, right? And a lot of the things, like if you get omega-3 sources of fish in a can and stuff like that, a lot of that stuff could be oxidized, right? And pretty not so good.
It's typically oxidized. And that's why I say when you take something like that, you should always, first, the ideal way to get it is from fish, because when you take omega-3 fats in fish, you're getting it in a form where it can more readily go to your brain, which is why most people take omega-3 fats in the first place. And also, you can tell when it's gone bad, right? Because a rancid fish is really obvious, where if you're taking, fish oil in some little capsule, you can't actually smell it so that you can tell if it's rancid or not. So when I was taking cod liver oil, I got the form where it was just a little jar, and I would take a dose with a spoon. And that way I would know if it was bad or not. You can smell it.
Right. And what does that smell? A really fishy smell?
Well, cod liver oil, that was a really interesting experiment. There was a period of about 6 months where I literally couldn't go to bed at night without my cod liver oil. And this was at the end of the period of my being maximally unhealthy. And one of the things that was, I'd broken at that point 6 bones in 2 years. So I was probably borderline osteopenic. There's a famous case where they gave a baby who had rickets cod liver oil, which is very high in vitamin D as well as in omega-3 fats. And the baby ate enough cod liver oil until the baby cured its rickets and then never touched it again. So similar to that baby, I couldn't live without cod liver oil for 6 months, and I haven't touched it since. So It's interesting. You know, your body knows in an unconscious way what you need, right? That's why we crave things. And so long as we're not messing with that craving capacity, generally, you know, it's going to be a pretty good guide to what you should and shouldn't be eating. If you've, you know, and that's, you know, everybody's familiar with that when it comes to pregnant women, where their tastes generally shift dramatically, and that's thought to be protective of the fetus, that they're, you know, seeking out foods that are more nutritious to the fetus and avoiding foods that are going to be detrimental to the fetus.
Right. So when you see all these folks saying, you know, omega-6 is totally fine, you need to up it, it really, there's not a lot of evidence for why people should be consuming. You put it on Twitter today. You said the question is, what is the evidence for greater than 5% of your energy coming from PUFA? That's the intervention, and that's what we need evidence for. How is this higher than 5% of our energy intake from PUFA? How is that an intervention? What does that mean?
Well, the 5% was a number that somebody threw out there. He said, you know, I'd like to see some evidence that less than 5% is good for us. Well, you know, back in 1961, the American Heart Association put out a bulletin saying that everybody in America should start eating more seed oils. And they were essentially prescribing it to the entire country as if it was a drug, right? I mean, now they prescribe statins because statins lower LDL. Well, in 1961, the only thing they had that would reliably lower your LDL cholesterol level was seed oils. So without having any evidence at the time that it was going to be beneficial, they went and prescribed to the entire country that we start consuming more seed oils. Now, there were 2 problems with that. The first obvious problem was that they didn't have any direct evidence that it was going to be actually beneficial, right? Because it's well known in medicine that just because you can move a marker like LDL doesn't mean you're actually going to change the outcome. And then when the studies actually started coming out showing outcomes in humans, they found that it does indeed lower LDL, but that the people with lower LDL tended to have worse cardiovascular disease outcomes.
Right.
So it was counterproductive. And the most ridiculous thing about that recommendation was that in 1961, the intake of seed oils had been going up steadily for, 60-plus years since the beginning of the 20th century, as had the rate of heart disease. So even in 1961, as some doctors said, wait a minute, back several decades ago when we had almost no heart attacks, we also had almost no seed oils. So how is it that eating more of them is going to prevent them?
Right. I mean, I'm looking at this piece from some website called diabetesincontrol.com. It says the link between diabetes and risk and polyunsaturated fatty acids, these PUFA fats, it says higher consumption of linoleic acid and higher levels in the body may mitigate diabetes risk. That's what they're saying. So they say that the health advantages of this have been demonstrated. American Heart Association, the dietary guidelines for Americans say that we should be eating, it says, north of 5 to 10% of total calories a day from linoleic acid. How can they, by what basis are they making these claims? They talk about this meta-analysis.
Well, it's more statistical flimflammery. So a lot of that research comes out of the Harvard School of Public Health, and we've discussed this before. They found that the most obesogenic food is seed oils, particularly fried potatoes, right? And then they turned around and they did another study, and they found that type 2 diabetes was related to seed oil consumption. And then here's the statistical flimflammery. They turned around and adjusted it by body weight, right? So this is like saying if you are concerned that bullets cause death, right? You know, bullets fired from guns cause death. You're going to adjust it by bleeding, okay? Right. Well, people who get shot bleed a lot, right? So if we adjust their death rate by bleeding, then we can show statistically that bullets fired from guns don't cause death. Right. Well, obviously that's ridiculous, right? The bleeding is part of death, just like the obesity is part of diabetes. So you're adjusting it by something effectively, and I consulted a statistician on this, because you're cheating and trying to hide it. Right? So back to this basic argument, over the last 100 years, we've seen two things happen in the same period of time. We have seen a huge increase in our consumption of seed oils, and we have seen a huge increase in the rate of type 2 diabetes in the United States. So my question to them is, since they're both going up at the same time, and you're claiming that that should be the reverse, at what time are we going to be consuming enough seed oils so we could get back to the level of diabetes that we had before we consumed seed oils, when it was a very rare disease? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So I got a comment from or a question from a listener named Joe. Says, please ask Tucker Goodrich if hydrogenation, so you have to explain what that is for our listeners, but please ask if hydrogenation impacts the proliferation of linoleic acid in adipose tissue, fat tissue.
Oh, that's a great question. It would impact it, yes. It would make it lower. So ideally, what hydrogenation does is add hydrogen atoms to unsaturated fat molecules to turn them into saturated fats, right? So if you do it perfectly, you're changing linoleic acid, which is missing a couple of hydrogen atoms, and you're turning it into Brad Marshall's favorite fat, stearic acid. So instead of linoleic acid, if you hydrogenate a fat, instead of consuming linoleic acid, you're consuming stearic acid. That's why it gets firm, right? Stearic acid is the primary fat in beef tallow, which is very, if you've ever seen it, it's what you make it's what you can make candles or soap out of. So yeah, absolutely. Hydrogenation is going to lower the level of linoleic acid that goes into your adipose tissue, because it's going to lower the level of linoleic acid that you're consuming. The problem is hydrogenation isn't a perfect process, and you get these synthetic trans fats that are partially hydrogenated fats, and those can be toxic in the body. They impair all sorts of mitochondrial and metabolic functions. Although, interestingly enough, there's only one study I've seen that compared hydrogenated trans fats to linoleic acid directly, and they were better than the linoleic acid was.
Wow.
They were healthier than the linoleic acid was, let's put it that way.
Yeah, but so that would have been, what would be hydrogenated fats for people just not familiar with that term?
Crisco.
Margarine, right?
Yeah, margarines, they hydrogenate lard, because lard nowadays has a lot of seed oils in it, because, they're feeding pork grains and seed oils to fatten them up. So people expect their lard to be kind of firm, so they hydrogenate it.
I see. So this is something that is not as bad as seed oils, or pretty much just as bad, would you say?
Well, most hydrogenation is kind of, because of the trans fat issue, hydrogenation has gone very much out of favor. So, there are some trans fats that are made when you cook, but hydrogenation isn't generally that much of a health concern anymore because of the trans fats, because the FDA banned trans fats, except for very low levels from most foods a number of years ago.
So, when you see that kind of stuff, where do you think the focus of research should continue as more and more people are starting to be aware of these serious health effects from vegetable oils and stuff? Where do you think the next frontier of research needs to be focused if more enterprising researchers and people who are not blinded by dumb ideology start to get into the mix of this?
Well, I'm honestly hard-pressed to know what is necessary because so much research has been done already. I think really, not to toot my own horn and your horn too, but we need to make people aware of the research that's already been done, right? Most people aren't aware that we have multiple human studies in RCT showing that seed oils have a negative effect on heart health, and they won't learn it from the American Heart Association. So that is, they won't learn from the Harvard School of Public Health that seed oils cause obesity because the Harvard School of Public Health gets paid by the seed oil manufacturers and they misrepresent their findings. So, I really do think, there are lots of studies that we could do, but, we're getting to the point where doing an RCT where you're going to cause harm to somebody based on the overwhelming amount of evidence starts becoming pretty unethical.
Well, very good. I really appreciate your time, Tucker, and the work that you're doing, pioneering these things into the media, along with other great folks just like you doing this good stuff. And I want people to check out yelling-stop.blogspot.com to see your blog on these topics and others. And anybody coming up, any guests coming up on your podcast on YouTube?
Yeah, Tom, this interview with Tom Breno is going to be released in the next day or two, and that should be a must-listen to everybody. He's a top-tier scientist, and he's done research in human children showing the harms of too much seed oil consumption.
Wow, very good. But check Tucker Goodrich on YouTube as well. That's it for Hour 1, folks. We'll be back with Hour 2, but in the meantime, remember, you can email us hello@aneighborschoice.com. That's hello@aneighborschoice.com. And remember that all these things that we're talking about, you can go back to our archives on aneighborschoice.com, click on health and nutrition. I don't think you'll find a better lineup of guests and cross pollination of research and ideas on the topic of nutrition and particularly vegetable oils and these other things that are related to this topic. It's all exciting. This is the frontier. This is the beginning of the renaissance of our health transformations when it comes to mental health, physical health, so many things that can be fixed if we start to challenge these rotten sacred cows that have long served past their due date. I'm David Gronowski. Godspeed.